German POWs thought America was weak, then Camp Edwards issued them these shoes, August 25, 1943. Camp Edwards, Massachusetts. The intake building smelled of fresh-cut pine and hot metal, like a workshop that never slept. Fluorescent tubes buzzed overhead, washing every face in pale, clinical light that made men look tired and honest. 48 German prisoners stood in a line that had no horizon, their boots still carrying the dust of a different continent. A quartermaster clerk slid a cardboard box across the table toward Jeff Rider Karl Metz. It hit the wood with a dull thud, heavy for its size. Brown paper was folded tight and tied with string that looked new enough to belong in a store window. Metz loosened it slowly, as if speed might break whatever fragile logic still held his world together. If these quiet, human moments inside the war are what you come here for, take a second to like this video, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. A small town, a big city, a night shift break room, a kitchen table. These stories belong to everyone who still listens carefully. The paper opened, and the smell came first real leather, oil, and tannery sharpness, the scent of something made without fear of running out. The shoes were not patched, not rebuilt, not cut from older pairs. They were new, sized, and finished like an object intended to be ordinary. In that moment, Metz understood something the battlefield had never fully taught him. Germany could still fight, but it could not match this. 2 years earlier, he had marched under banners that promised inevitability. He had watched maps change at speed that felt like proof, borders redrawn before the ink dried. The early victories taught men to confuse momentum with destiny. It was a dangerous lesson because momentum is loud and destiny is supposed to be quiet. The war had started correcting that lesson by the time Metz reached North Africa. There, victory was not a parade, but a grind of sun, sand, and engines that ate fuel like hunger. The desert cared about water and spare parts, not slogans. By early 1943, Tunisia became a narrowing trap. The sky belonged to the Allies more often than not, and supply columns shortened, then vanished. When Metz was captured, it did not feel like grand defeat, just the slow closing of a door that had been creaking for months. The ocean crossing was long enough to unmake time. Days blurred into salt air and stale heat below deck. Men tried to keep their minds sharp by counting, by staring at the same boards until they memorized every knot. When land finally returned, it was not Europe. America greeted them with rail lines, wide roads, and constant truck traffic. The prisoners watched towns slide past, houses with intact windows, streets without rubble. They had been trained to imagine America as soft, a place that could not endure hardship. Yet everything they passed looked like endurance built into the landscape. Camp Edwards sat on Cape Cod as a training city made from lumber and urgency. Barracks stretched in long rows, mess halls and offices arranged like a blueprint turned real. A place designed entirely for throughput, for processing men as if men were shipments. At its edge, a fenced compound waited. The POW enclosure could hold about 2,000 men. The fence was real, but it did not feel desperate. Metz had expected cruelty, chaos, and vengeance because that is what propaganda promised and fear demanded. He had arrived prepared to suffer. He was not prepared to be issued new shoes. The 1929 Geneva Convention required the detaining power to supply prisoners with clothing, underwear, and footwear with regular replacement and repair. Those words sounded like legal dust, something officials argued over in distant rooms. At Camp Edwards, those words became leather and wool and soap placed on a table without ceremony. Metz stared at the shoes as if they might dissolve under scrutiny. The leather was thick, cut cleanly, stitching unhurried. The sole had a firmness that pressed back under his thumb, springy, whole. He had not felt that kind of resilience underfoot in a long time. He remembered German boots from the early campaigns, solid and proud, built in a world that still believed in steady supply. But the longer the war dragged, the more the boot became a problem. Leather competed with belts, harnesses, and industrial needs that multiplied with every new division formed. Shortages arrived not all at once, but through substitutions, a cheaper sole, a thinner insole, inferior nails on a repair. Men learned to ignore small declines because the war demanded forward motion, and admitting decline felt like admitting defeat. On the Eastern Front, those declines became brutal. Mud and slush found every weakness. A boot that took on water in freezing weather was not an inconvenience. It was an injury. A soldier could endure hunger and fear, but wet feet in winter could destroy him without a bullet. Metz had not fought in Russia, but he had seen the same logic in Africa. Heat-cracked leather. Sand ground solace. Repairs grew desperate. A boot that could not be repaired was a confession that the system behind it was failing. At Camp Edwards, the system behind the shoes looked untouched by desperation. The clerk handed out pairs the way he might distribute pencils. A guard nearby held the bored posture of a man assigned to a task that no longer felt dramatic. The prisoners, however, treated each box like a fragile artifact. Metz slipped one shoe on. It fit with an accuracy that startled him. Not close enough, not tolerable correct, as if someone had built a process capable of matching human bodies to industrial output without guesswork. He tightened the laces and felt the upper take shape around his foot, firm but not punishing. Around the room, men made quiet sounds they had not intended to make. A sharp inhale, a small laugh that died quickly. Paper rustled, then slowed, as if the entire room was trying to absorb what it was touching. The shoes were not just equipment. They were evidence. Near the far door, a pile of worn American footwear sat like trash. A guard kicked it aside without looking down, clearing the walkway in a single careless motion. The leather in that discard heap was better than what many German soldiers still wore in the field. Metz watched the casual waste and felt his stomach tighten for a reason that had nothing to do with hunger. The first days at Camp Edwards felt unreal. Barracks were simple but solid. Camp lights burned through evening without blackout. Metz had grown accustomed to darkness as necessity, to power conserved, to cities dimmed for survival. Here, the lights simply stayed on. Food arrived 3 times a day, measured and sufficient. Bread was soft in a way that felt almost obscene to men raised on dense campaign loaves. Coffee appeared without ceremony. Meat arrived with a frequency that contradicted what families were writing about back home. Some prisoners assumed the camp was staging a performance for newcomers. Metz waited for portions to shrink, for quality to drop, for the machinery to reveal weakness. The shift never came. By war's end, about 425,000 German POWs would be held across hundreds of American camps. Camp Edwards was one node in a system designed for volume without strain. That system extended beyond fences. Prisoners worked maintenance, operational tasks, and contract labor at nearby farms and industrial sites, moving through an America that felt disturbingly normal. The first time Metz rode out in a truck, He watched Cape Cod unspool in strips of pine, sand, and salt air, nothing like the coal smoke of European cities. Roads were intact. The war felt distant here, not because Americans were unaware, but because their home ground had not been physically reduced. On farms, prisoners harvested in numbers that mattered less than what the work revealed. The civilian economy still functioned, still moved food from field to table. In 1944, German prisoners helped harvest tens of thousands of quarts of strawberries. Metz began noticing quiet abundance in details. Tools were available. Spare parts appeared when machines broke. In Germany, breakdowns meant improvisation and delay. Here, they were treated like routine problems with routine solutions. The difference was not moral. It was logistical. Within the training grounds, the army had built a mock German village, Deutschdorf, used for urban warfare practice. Facades assembled to resemble enemy streets, some structures only three-sided, convincing from the front and hollow behind, because the purpose was training, not permanence. Prisoners sometimes glimpsed it from a distance, a fake Germany under a Massachusetts sky. It did not feel like mockery. It felt like preparation executed with casual resources. Metz could not decide what disturbed him more, that America built a counterfeit village to practice destroying the real one, or that it could do so without hesitation. The longer he lived inside camp routine, the more the shoes returned to his mind. They lasted. They held through work details, gravel, wet weather, and cold mornings. Every day they carried him with the quiet reliability of a system that expected replacement before failure. In Germany, men lived past a failure point, pushing equipment until it broke, then attempting resurrection. This was the real shock of the shoes, not their quality alone, but the attitude that surrounded them. No one treated them as precious. They were issued like a form, like a stamp, an item with a place in a schedule and a replacement date on a ledger. Metz began to understand a truth that propaganda never included. A nation that replaces ordinary items easily is a nation that can replace extraordinary losses too. Courage mattered, training mattered, leadership mattered, but those things were carried on feet. Feet needed boots. Boots needed leather, rubber, labor, and transportation. War reduced itself, again and again, to materials. In 1943, American factories produced over 85,000 aircraft, turning airframes into a kind of weather system that moved across oceans. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards built 2,710 Liberty ships, roughly 3 every 2 days. That rhythm meant food, fuel, ammunition, and vehicles could keep moving even when submarines took what came before. Metz did not sit reciting those numbers. He absorbed them through daily evidence, the steady issues, the reliable meals, the lights that never flickered, the worn footwear discarded without crisis. As months passed, prisoners compared notes in low voices. Men from Africa described Allied supply dumps with fuel drums stacked like walls. Men from Italy spoke of trucks appearing on mountain roads with dependable regularity. Even those who clung hardest to ideology struggled to explain what their own eyes had recorded. Some tried to reinterpret everything as performance, a calculated display. But consistency made deception impossible to maintain. A trick cannot remain perfect across an entire country, across hundreds of camps, across hundreds of thousands of men, day after day. Letters arrived through censorship on thin paper. Metz wrote home without stating what would be stopped. He described being treated decently. He described work, weather, routine, shoes that fit and held up. Between the lines, the truth pressed forward, because truth has weight even when hidden. From home, letters described shortages, substitutions, rationing, nights darkened by blackout. Metz read those letters under electric light that did not dim, wearing shoes that did not need repair. It was not pleasure that settled in him. It was a quiet dread, because the contrast suggested an outcome too large to argue with. In September 1944, the great Atlantic hurricane struck Cape Cod. On the 14th, wind tore trees from the ground and scattered debris across roads and beaches. For a moment, even America looked fragile. But what followed revealed a different kind of strength. Prisoners were sent out in work details to clear timber and repair damaged boatyards. Portable sawmills salvaged several million board feet of lumber. Trucks arrived. Tools appeared. The disruption was processed like any other logistical problem, absorbed into the machine. In Germany, a storm layered onto war would have deepened shortages. Here, it became another task on a schedule. That autumn, new prisoners arrived. Metz watched them stand in the intake building where he had once stood. Watched the same cardboard boxes slide across the same tables. Watched brown paper peel back and saw the same disbelief ripple across new faces the same moment, repeated like a ritual of revelation. A prisoner lifted a shoe and pressed his thumb into the sole. The same gesture Metz had made, the same silent test for reality. The man's shoulders tightened, then slumped, as if something heavy had settled into place. Near the door, the discard pile was there again. Worn American shoes kicked aside without reverence. Metz stared at that pile longer than he meant to. Each pair represented miles walked by a soldier who could simply be issued another pair when these wore out. In Germany, those same worn shoes would have been collected, repaired, redistributed, fought over. This was the climax that did not look like a climax. No gunfire, no announcement. Just the repetition of ordinary abundance displayed without emotion. Metz felt the final idea lock into place with the cold certainty of arithmetic. Germany was fighting with everything it had, while America was fighting with what it could spare. When the war ended, repatriation became another process, another set of lists and schedules. Metz left America with a body that had not starved, with hands that had worked, with a mind forced to confront what ideology had hidden. He did not leave as a man who loved America. He left as a man who understood it. Those are not the same thing. He returned to a Germany physically broken, a landscape of gaps where buildings had been, and silence where cities once hummed. Shortages continued. Repairs became a way of life again. The nation that had promised inevitability now lived in the long aftershock of having reached its limits. Years later, the memory that returned most often was not of battle or retreat or surrender. It was of that fluorescent-lit room on Cape Cod, the smell of leather and oil, the feel of a new sole under a thumb, the sight of a guard kicking away worn shoes without looking down, as if waste itself were a privilege. History loves its grand turning points, named operations, famous speeches, flags raised over ruined capitals. But sometimes the true turn happens quietly, where no camera looks and no reporter stands. Sometimes it happens when a tired soldier realizes the war is not only a contest of bravery, but a contest of supply chains and factories and raw materials, shaped into ordinary objects. For Karl Metz, the shoes at Camp Edwards were not comfort. They were a message, delivered plainly in leather and rubber, stamped with the quiet power of a nation whose production did not tremble. And once he understood that message, the outcome of the war no longer felt like a question. It felt like something already written beneath his feet.